Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is kiodiekin. Welcome back to the channel. I hope you guys are all having a great day. And in today's video review, I wanted to address an old adage question because I know this is asked primarily within the retro gaming space. And that question is, how does this single board computer compare to the Raspberry Pi 5 or to the Raspberry Pi 4? And so recently, and this doesn't happen just recently, is also asked across a number of different forums, whether I'm in Facebook, Instagram, or also my Patreon subscribers and also other Facebook groups, is how does one single board computer compare to the Pi 5 or to the Pi 4? And I strongly believe that this question is asked because typically we see, or people in the single board community, because the RetroPie or Raspberry Pi is usually at the top of their game within that particular genre, is it is the catapult in which most single board computers are measured. So, for example, I see a lot of people, whether they be resellers or people making YouTube content, they'll say, hey, how does that compare to a Raspberry Pi 4 or 5? And they'll say, oh, it's much stronger than a Raspberry Pi 4 or 5. They don't show specs, they don't show any numbers, they don't show performance. They just use the idea that that board is stronger than something else because they're trying to sell it or maybe woo you to that device. And so, again, recently I was asked by two guys in the RetroPie group in regards to the Radexa or Raxa X2L. This is a new single board computer that I picked up for 40 bucks. Got it shipped out. In fact, I think I was like one of the only guys to do a review on it. Had a lot of good compliments on that board. A lot, and in fact, after my video review, it sold out in a couple of days. And so other people too want to know is how does this board compare to the Raspberry Pi 5? And so next to me, we have most of the leading single board computers that are in the market right now. So we have three Raspberry Pi 5s, one, two, three. These are all 8 GB models. We have the brand new Ratsa X2L. Also have here the brand new Zima board, which was sent over to me for review. This is primarily used as a home server, not primarily used for a lot of other methods for tinkering or gaming, but it's primarily used for a home server. And on the far right, we have a Purple Pi. You guys won't see too many videos on that. We'll get into that a little bit. We have the Orange Pi, which is using the RK3588 chip. And we have the brand new UY2 R1 single board computer. This one also uses the RK3588 chip. All of these boards here use ARM. And then, and of course, the Raspberry Pi 5 uses ARM technology as well. And then in the back here, in fact, I'll lay this down. We have the Intel-based PC. This is using the N95 chip. It is a mini PC, which most people now are gravitating to for an emulation use. As you guys can see that there. I got this on Amazon for about $127. They typically run for about $169. Great device. And then we have another new single board computer. This one was sent over to me for review by the UUT company, but I also bought one as well. This is the X1. And so I wanted to lay out all of these here because these are, in my opinion, the top of the cream of the crop, top of the line single board computers that you can currently get on the market, especially if you are into some form of emulation. Now, there are other boards such as the R1 and the Orange Pi 5 that also use the RK3588 chip, so they would be classified in that as well as the Radexa Rock Pi 5B would also be included in this as well. And so wanted to lay out all of these here so you guys can see it. And you may be asking again to answer that question. It's kind of a tricky one to answer. So again, the question is, how does the performance of this compare to a Raspberry Pi 5? Now, before we get into that, I want to show you guys some numbers. We're going to go take a look at the Geekbench 6 results. I'm going to pull these up here. And let's go ahead and take a look at some of my personal results. Now, typically, when most people are doing reviews on YouTube or they're showcasing, they'll say, yeah, the Raspberry Pi 5 is stronger than any other single board computer, or the Orange Pi 5 is stronger than the Pi 5. But let's take a look at a few numbers here. So These are my personal results here from all the boards that you're seeing here, except for the Ratsa X2L. At the top, you'll see a registered single core score of 1203 on the single core and 2619 on the multi-core score. That is the mini PC that I showed you. Now, if we scroll down here to the bottom, we have a number of test results here on the Orange Pi 5. We have two different results on the single core, which brings up 1800 megahertz is 845 on the single core, and on the multi-core score, we have 3033. Now, let's take a look at the UYI2 X1 single board computer, which uses the N5105 X86 base chip. Comes in at $489 and $1399. The Orange Pi 5 and the Raspberry Pi 5, which measures at 886 and 1664, is twice as powerful as the X86 UYI2 X1 single board computer. Now, as far as the Radexa X2L, this chipset is one chip underneath the UYI2 X1, which is this one here. This is the one with the 489 score, and I should have had a split screen up, but this is the one here that's registering at 489. Raspberry Pi typically will come in at an average of about 880 or so, and then of course the Orange Pi 5 will come in at about 880 or so on the single core function, but about 3000 something on the multi-core score. But did you know that this thing right here and this board, in most cases, will kick the crap out of either one of these two boards in terms of performance? But yet, when you guys will see a review, when you see a review such as looking at these numbers, most of you and most content creators will show you and say, oh, well, obviously it's higher on Geekbench 6, so obviously that board is better. And there's a tricky part to that. So months ago when I was doing my research, because I got tired of all the bottlenecks, what happened was last year when we started development on the Orange Pi 5, I knew that we had more than enough power to do emulation. And the first video I did, N64 was still hiccuping once we had RetroPie going. And again, that's using a gaming front end. For some of these ARM-based boards, such as the Orange Pi 5 and also the Raspberry Pi 5, you will get a better performance if you're using Android. But for the most part, most of us use Batacera, Recalbox, RetroPie, or some type of gaming front end. And so I got tired of all the bottlenecks. And gee, man, we have more than enough power to run some of these games like N64, Sega Dreamcast, not Sega Dreamcast, I'm sorry, but Sega Saturn, NFL Blitz, Killer Instinct, Mace, some of the other CHD games, Carnival. They're still difficult to run if you're using an ARM-based PC. And so after doing my months of research, or actually weeks of research, I came down to the conclusion that the biggest differences between these single board computers is that even though this one just came out, the X2L and the X1, and also the Atomic Pi, which I'll show you guys here in a minute. This is the Atomic Pi. They all have one thing in common. They all use X86 architecture. Now, if you were to measure the Atomic Pi as well as the X1, of course, and even the X2L, they're not going to show up as high on a Geekbench 6 test as it would a Raspberry Pi 5 or Orange Pi 5 or some of the other single board computers out there. The reason why we've been having issues with emulation, and I've kind of gone over this in several other videos, is that we have two different architectures that we're working with. We have ARM versus X86. And so every pinpointed result that I turn to, looking up different chipsets, understanding big little architecture, everything brought me back to X86 performance. Now, if you guys aren't familiar with what X86 is, that is your Windows, typically your Windows-based Intel AMD type chips, which is why you guys have migrated over to your mini PCs, is because your mini PCs are X86. They are not ARM, and this is why the emulation runs better on these particular mini PCs, is because it's X86. Now, one other misconception is that most people will seem to believe that X86 is or these mini PCs are an alternative to Raspberry Pi 5s, and they're not. They're not an alternative because reason being is that these are single board computers where all the components are exposed in a skeletal-like format, and you have all of your GPIO pins here. You have full access to the entire board, and that is the biggest difference between a single board computer versus a mini PC. And as you can see here, this is a single board computer. You have all of your UART ports here. You have your GPIO pin headers, where if you need to attach a fan or attach additional module, this is a single board computer. So this UE2 X1 single board computer, as well as the RATSA X2L, are more comparable to a Raspberry Pi 5 than using a mini PC form factor. Now, in terms of price, yeah, you can compare it if you're looking for emulation, or if you're comparing it in price. This is like $80 plus all the accessories, brings you out to about $130, $140. You know, I got this for about $127. So in that sense, yes, they are comparable, but not in the full sense that this is a single board computer. This is a single board computer. However, this is a single board computer, but this is not a single board computer. So there's a minor difference there, especially when you're working on projects. So looking at some of the specs here, just to kind of go over this briefly, we're going to take a look at ARM versus X86. Two processing architectures dominate the computing market, X86 versus ARM. We're going to kind of skip through some of this because I think a lot of this is just really redundant. And so what are the main differences between ARM versus X86? Well, ARM uses reduced instruction set computing, while X86 uses complex instructions set with computing. ARM has fewer instructions, whereas an X86 chip is harder to design because the chip has to be able to account for the complex instructions, making X86 chips typically more expensive. I think the better term or phrase would be or for X86 instructions, they're more complex. They're able to handle additional tasks compared to ARM. If you're using an ARM-based chip, which is typically used in your cell phone or your PDA, they're more or less used for lower power devices, which in my opinion, they kind of defeat the purpose if we're using it as a desktop PC, quote unquote, because you typically leave those plugged in. But ARM chips are more or less made for, let's say, your Samsung phones, your iPhones, your PDAs, pocket PDAs, any other type of portable devices. They're made for, let's say, your Steam Decks, things of that nature. Whereas when you're using an x86 processor, it's more or less made not because for a mobile purpose, but it's made for a desktop use. The only problem in that is when we're buying most of these single board computers and mini PCs, we're not trying to use or run this stuff off of a battery. Now, I do know that they have your case, but primarily we're using this as a desktop computer. We're not looking to plug this into a battery and go mobile for several hours. So that kind of defeats the purpose in what we're kind of doing, especially in terms of emulation, if you're trying to get the most out of your device from a power or a complex instruction. So some of the biggest differences are the main high level between ARM versus x86 is that they favor simplicity and fast execution of a single instruction, and x86 prioritizes more complex instructions. So that is why we get different results with some of these programs and some of these emulators when we're trying to run, let's say, your NFL blitzes, your MAMEs, versus running some additional programs. Now, there are certain particular emulators, such as the Ether emulator, Ether SFX2. You guys have seen me optimize that on the Raspberry Pi 5. That particular emulator, that particular program was designed specifically for ARM. It does not work on x86 or a PC interface. If I was to use PlayStation 2 emulation, I'm going with either Play or some of the other I can't remember the name of it, but there's another PlayStation emulator which we use. I think it's PSP2 that we use primarily for emulation because that's developed for the x86 architecture. All right, so again, here we have all the top or some of the top of the line single board computers and computers that are currently within the genre. The Raspberry Pi 5, it clocks at a stock 2.4 gigahertz. This one has 8 gigabytes of RAM. We have the UE2 X1 single board computer. I'll pull it back up here again so you guys can see it. This one is stock at about, I think, 2.2 or 2.0 gigahertz, and it has a clock speed up to about 2.9 gigahertz. Again, you don't overclock this. It slightly adjusts as it needs to. And with this board, I've been able to emulate all the way up to a PlayStation 2 runs fine. It runs great, by the way, with no modifications or adjustments. Running RetroPie on the Raspberry Pi 5, there's a ton of tinkering that I've had to do just to be able to get a lot of the games run. But even some of the games that run on the Pi 5 with PlayStation through RetroPie, which the Supreme team is the only one that's been able to successfully get PlayStation 2 emulation working through the gaming front end. There's a lot of hiccups. There's a lot of flaws. On this one, it runs everything fine without me having to touch anything. And then, of course, this will also emulate Fightcade, and you can also run Technoparrot. Low-end Technoparrot games will run on this. I was also able to run, what's the name of that game? Alien Extermination. So again, keep that number in mind. This one shows up at about 400 and something on a Geekbench 6 test, whereas this one shows up at about 800 overclocked to about 3 gigahertz. So a lot of that has to do with the architecture, not so much just the power and performance. But again, if you watch most reviews, things that are out there, they'll say the Raspberry Pi 5 is much stronger than something like this, simply measuring by numbers, but they never factor in any architecture. Now, the Ratsa X2L, this one is currently $40, and I know right now they're sold out. And this particular board, Intel Celeron J4125. Now, this is a very low profile single board computer chip. This one is one step underneath the UE2X1, but both of these boards are much higher than the Atomic Pi. And the Atomic Pi, let me see if I can pull that up here. The Atomic Pi uses the Atom A5Z8 350. Now, the Atomic Pi is also another chip or another single board computer which can run games like your NFL Blitzes, your Killer Instinct. And a lot of the guys, they couldn't understand it why. In fact, there was a guy back in 2019, he had the Raspberry Pi 4 and he couldn't understand it. It was like, well, how come the Raspberry Pi 4 is much more powerful than the Atomic Pi, but Killer Instinct and other games run perfectly fine on this, but it doesn't on the Raspberry Pi 5. He couldn't figure it out, and the guy was really, really frustrated. But again, if you look closely, this is an Intel-based X86 chip. It has 480 megahertz of GPU. The base clock speed is 1.9 gigahertz on that chip. Again, if you were to run a test on this, I believe the Atomic Pi would probably be somewhere around maybe 250 to about mid 300s on a Geekbench 6 test. But again, if you were to use just those tests alone to determine your buying qualification, whether or not certain games will run, you would totally miss the mark, because typically we're looking at these kind of scores to determine our purchasing decision versus actually understanding the architecture of the computer itself. So again, these are all of my Pi 5 tests. All of these would dominate or kill an Atomic Pi, but the Atomic Pi would outdo it in performance. In fact, you should be able to run some PlayStation 2 games on the Atomic Pi, even though it's not talked about too much. So, you know, I'll see if I can find some videos on that if you guys want to research that. But this should be able to possibly run maybe some PlayStation 2 games with some optimizations. But that's pretty much it in terms of where we are with those particular boards. So coming back here to the Ratsa X2L, move it up here so you guys can see a little bit better. Again, this chipset is one step down above the X1 and definitely a little bit more powerful than the Atomic Pi, which I got finished showing you guys. And so obviously this is still in cellophane. I have not opened it, but based upon schematics, when I did my last video, I told you guys this should be able to run all of your basic Atari games, your ZX Spectrums and all that other stuff, all the way up to PlayStation 2 emulation. And this might be able to handle some Technoparrot games, the low-end ones. It should, based upon the numbers. Found another YouTube video where a guy actually had it, or this particular board, and he was running quite a few PlayStation 2 games and some of the other harder to run systems within this chipset. And I made that surmise simply because I understand the architecture now and what we're dealing with, whereas before, when I was working with the Raspberry Pi 4 and also the Orange Pi, it was more or less like, yeah, well, at least especially the Raspberry Pi 4, I was more or less like, well, gee, well, let's just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And the devs in the community, well, let's keep pushing. Let's see what else we can squeeze out of this. And we're going to wait for more development, more development. And that's typically something you'll hear within the single board community is we need more development, more development. But sometimes that development never comes. And because a lot of us don't understand or didn't fully understand what it is we were getting into or what it was we were getting into, we were operating very blindly. And so that didn't happen thanks to the Orange Pi 5. When the Orange Pi 5 came out, I said, look, we have more than enough power here. If it can't run a Killer Instinct or Blitz, we're missing it somewhere. And so, again, my research led me down the track of X86 single board computers. And so to answer your question, is this board more powerful than a Raspberry Pi 5? And if you're using it for emulation, the question is yes. It is more powerful than a Raspberry Pi 5 in that regard. Now, if you're using this for some additional AI computations or some other things, there are some additional benefits, which I'm not going to measure here. Please keep in mind, most of this video is dedicated to understanding emulation in terms of their, addressing the person's question is, would a board like this be more powerful than a Raspberry Pi 5 or probably even an Orange Pi 5? Most cases, if you're trying to use a gaming front end or using it for emulation, your answer is going to be yes. Because a lower measured X86 chip that may appear on, let's say, a Geekbench 6 or maybe some other test will outperform an ARM-based device. And I have the numbers. I have the performance to improve, to prove upon it. On the Raspberry Pi 5 with PlayStation 2, emulation using Tekken Tag Tournament was pretty much unplayable. The slowdown time was there, and I'm speaking from the RetroPie standpoint. It might run full speed on Android. I haven't spent a lot of time, and I'm not sure if Android is fully compatible right now on the Pi 5, but I do know that Android is compatible. You also have DJ Show on the Orange Pi 5. Haven't spent too much time with that. That might be your only way to get the full performance out of a chipset like that. But if you're using like a RetroPie, Batacera, Jellos, Recall Box. I'm not sure if Recall Box is on Orange Pi 5. I know it's on the Raspberry Pi 5. It's going to perform as it should. And typically you're going to have those bottlenecks because it doesn't see the full aspect of the board. But keep in mind, most of those emulators will work for X86. They work on ARM, but they're not fully compatible with ARM, which is why everything doesn't perform the way that it needs to be. I was playing not Time Crisis, but True Crime Streets of New York. I got videos of this on the Arcade Media website or YouTube channel as well as my channel. I got like 1 frame per second here and there, sometimes 20, sometimes 30. Ran it on the X1, 100% flawless. And this is a lower spec board in terms of performance, but ran it absolutely flawless. No hiccups, no drops. In fact, I think it ran at 103% speed without me doing any tinkering, any modifications, not messing around with any of the video drivers, nothing, 103%. Raspberry Pi 5, I threw everything I could except the kitchen sink at it, and I still measured, using RetroPie, for example, I measured somewhere at about maybe 1 frame per second, and it was off and on hiccupy as I ran through the neighborhood. I did a live stream the other night, specifically for Patreon members, and they saw the results, and they were just amazed just to know what the differences were. So why is this board important? And I know you guys have seen me talk about a little bit about this Radix X2L. The 2 gigabyte model right now retails or sells for $39.99. So in my opinion, if you are a home arcade modder, if you are again into retro gaming, and you're looking to spend the least amount possible and get the best bang for your buck out of it, this is the one that you definitely need to have. Now, if you want to spend a little bit more, this is the king of the crop. In my opinion, so far from what I've seen, this was the best ultimate single board computer of 2023 is the X1. This one starts at $109. They had it on special for Black Friday for $100. But this is one here. If you guys want a little bit more power with all of your peripherals, it has 4 USB ports on here, your Ethernet, Wi-Fi. And this one also has one of those electronic fields where you could use your cell phone, kind of tap it. You could get the accessories for that. They threw every little accessory at this thing. I mean, take a look at this. This is all built in. This, in my opinion, well, actually not in my opinion, but this factually would be a comparable measure to a Raspberry Pi 5 because it is a single board computer. And as you look at this Raspberry Pi 5, it doesn't have the M.2 slots. It doesn't. This right here, you can also add the 4G adapter if you want to. They put every possible connection that you could pretty much think of for a single board computer on this device. SD card slot. You have 3 outputs: HDMI, HDMI Mini. You also have your MIPI displays down here. You have 2 of those. Also have your M.2. You also have another slot here for your Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. The cool thing, and this one's cheaper too. And it came with the heatsink and the fan, and you will be able to run Fightcade and Technoparrot on a device like this. And because this supports Windows, Ubuntu, and Debian, you can go either way with either the mini PC or the Ratchet X2L, or this one because they're X86 chips. You can load Windows or Linux on here, and you would get much better performance with either Linux, obviously Debian, or Ubuntu than you want, running Windows, because you don't have all the different optimizations or different programs running in the back. Whereas this, or even the Orange Pi 5, you can load Windows on here, but it's not fully optimized. I think there's still some driver configurations where certain things won't work on the Raspberry Pi 5 and the Orange Pi 5. But again, with the X86 boards, you can go either way. You can install Windows, you can install Debian, Linux, or Ubuntu. Either one of those, and they run flawlessly under the X86 branch. This you can only install Android, and those are pretty much your options. You have Android and you have Linux, and then of course Ubuntu, which uses an absurd amount of processing power based upon what we've seen. In fact, we saw somebody do a hack job with RetroPie running Ubuntu, and it used 4 gigs of RAM. So yeah, if you had a 4 gig of RAM Raspberry Pi 5, you would have crashed out and it wouldn't have been able to run. But yeah, this one runs Ubuntu, obviously Linux and Debian, of course, too. But you don't have the option with these right now to be fully optimized and go to Windows. So those are pretty much your choices there. Again, I love all of these single board computers. We're going to fully dive into the UE2 R1 here, which uses the same type of interface. This is the same company that makes the R1, so you have the R1 and the X1 here. And then, of course, I have 3 Raspberry Pi 5 8GB models that I picked up at Micro Center. And they did send this one over for review. This was sent over for review, and the Zima board was sent over for review as well. However, this is a home-based media server, which is why I haven't done too much comparison of that one. And then, of course, we have the elusive Purple Pi. There's only probably like 5 videos on this, and we did manage to get something load. One of the guys from the Supreme team did get, I think he's using it as a home media server now. But this one has a pretty good GPU on here, but there's no support for this single board computer. So that's something else that's really to keep in mind when you ask a question as, hey, is that board stronger than a Raspberry Pi 4 or Raspberry Pi 5? So there are a few things to look at. One, is it X86 compatible? If it's X86, it's probably going to decimate it, even if it's in the same market. 2, is there any development? So the Raspberry Pi 5, the Orange Pi 5 has much more development than the Purple Pi, because there's literally no development for this single board computer. I could probably make a tutorial and show a few things. It would probably be the only one on YouTube. But those are the questions you need to ask yourself too, because a lot of people will look at a board and say, well, this Arcade 3399 or 3566 is more powerful than a Raspberry Pi 5, Pi 6. But keep in mind, the Raspberry Pi 5, Raspberry Pi Foundation is always optimizing and adding additional driver support. Even right now, if you try to compare apples to apples, RetroPie that we have, if you guys check out my Pi Resurrection video on the Orange Pi 5 versus RetroPie on this, Wii emulation, as well as some other emulation on the Raspberry Pi 5, even though it's not as powerful as the Orange Pi 5, will outperform the Orange Pi 5 simply because it has better better video drivers and better video implementation than it does on the Orange Pi 5. Even though this one is a much more powerful processor and a much better Mali GPU included on that Orange Pi 5. Now, There are several videos. I know I've never got around to really doing them. But if you compare running Nintendo Wii on Android to the Raspberry Pi 5 on the compared to the Orange Pi 5, the Orange Pi 5 will outperform the Raspberry Pi 5 with the Android-based operating system if you're using that particular OS. So again, your two major points and things that you definitely want to look at when you're considering which single board computer or which computer is more powerful than the next is it X86 versus ARM? And if you're using ARM, which company made it and how much support is behind it? And even though it may be ARM, you have teams out there like Armbian and Debian, which are different repos. They provide driver support because without those distros, I'm sorry, not repos, but distros, you won't be able to have access to your video drivers. You won't have access to like your Bluetooth, your Wi-Fi, and all your other peripherals that work directly on this, or your USB. So if they don't support those particular ARM boards, and I don't think that either one of them support this Purple Pi, your board is pretty much going to be useless. And again, typically when you see a lot of YouTube video reviews and people are saying, you know, which board is better or whatnot, and I've even seen like Linus Tech Tips and other videos, they'll say, well, these boards here are compatible to a Raspberry Pi 4, to a Raspberry Pi 5. Because remember, a few months ago, when we had that Raspberry Pi 4 shortage, most people came out with videos saying, well, these are your alternatives. Well, those alternatives could be absolutely useless if there was absolutely no development for it, like the Purple Pi. Now, I didn't see any Purple Pis pop up, but there's literally no development for this thing whatsoever. In fact, when I got the instructions and everything else, they were in Chinese. And in order for me to get the drivers to fully unlock it, do you know I had to call and message the company in the middle of the night in China? I think it was like 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. my time, just to be able to get the OS, the proprietary OS for that, just to get it to work. But people will say, well, all these single board computers, they'll look at it and say, well, this board has 4 USB ports. This one has 4 USB ports. They're the same form factor, so obviously they're an alternative to one another. And that's pretty much the gist of the video. Is that if you couldn't find a Raspberry Pi 4, oh, this one has HDMI, that one has HDMI. This one has an Ethernet port. Look, is this a comparable to a Raspberry Pi 4? Well, obviously, just looking at it, most people would tell you, yeah. The GPIO pins, this is a Raspberry Pi 4, by the way. They're laid out in the same spot. You have 2 USB 3.0s, 2 USB 2.0s, an Ethernet port. You got your GPIO pin. Obviously, it looks the same, and I think this one was like $30 or something of that nature. But they're simply looking at hardware, but they're not factoring in any support. They're not factoring in any driver support for any of these single board computers, and that's literally all they're looking at is essentially hardware without any community. And that's why the Raspberry Pi is so popular, because it has a more robust user base and support for the community. However, that community definitely does not trump anything that goes on within the x86, because Linux is fully compatible with x86 environment. You will have no problems installing most applications on here. Everything runs natively and smoothly. In fact, you know what? I haven't even shown you guys a video yet, but we have RetroPie running through an x86 environment. Runs lag-free, no issues, no hiccups, no concerns. But again, looking at the numbers, obviously the Raspberry Pi 5 and the Orange Pi 5 are much better single-board computers based upon a Geekbench 6 test, which will show up here. In fact, let's go ahead and look at this test really quick. 489, 1399 multi-score. If we were going to set a baseline, and let's go back to results really quickly, and let's pick out we'll pick out the Raspberry Pi 5 where it's overclocked. So I had this one here, and we can see the Raspberry Pi 5 outperforms the UYi 2 by 181% on the single core side, and on the multi-core side 115%. So if you're watching some reviews, some people will say, well, yeah, the Raspberry Pi 5 is a much more dominant single board computer. And that's only looking at the way these numbers are generated. It has nothing to do with emulation. This would not be a good idea to use specific numbers to determine whether or not a board can perform. Again, we have the Raspberry Pi 5. Look, 3 gigahertz. This is base at 2 gigahertz. And again, too, even though the clock speed on the X1 can go up to about 2.9 gigahertz, and this is at 3 gigahertz, this isn't factoring in the 2.9. It's factoring in the base at 2 gigahertz, one processor, 4 cores, Jasper Lake. But again, we're looking at different architectures because this is X86 over here. Over here on the right is X86, and this is using ARM. And those are your biggest differences. So that's how you guys should be shopping. That's how you should be comparing numbers. I wish more people would really break it down this way, because initially when I first got into this and started looking at this, we would all believe like, ooh, Raspberry Pi 4 is at 400 or whatever it might have been. In fact, let's go back to results. I want to pull up my Raspberry Pi 4 test. In fact, let's see here. In fact, let's go to Geekbench 5. So yeah, Raspberry Pi 4, 246, 243, 202. And these are some of the original tests, because Raspberry Pi 4 now on Geekbench 5 shows up at about 340, 350, because they've continually added better driver support. So some of you would ask, would the Radexa, let me jump back to it so you guys can see it. Can this outperform a Raspberry Pi 4 and 5? Oh man, in most cases, especially a Raspberry Pi 4, it would kick its butt. No competition for something like this. Even though this is a very low end Intel Celeron X86 chip, it will outperform a Raspberry Pi 4 for gaming. And again, I haven't looked at all the other AI configurations and computations, but this will definitely beat out all in regards to that. But if you looked at these numbers, which again, some of these numbers on this one would show about maybe a mid 200, maybe a mid 300 or so. But this can run PlayStation 2 for $40. And possibly, I'll try it when I get around to it, possibly should run some low-end Techno-Parry games like your Alien Extermination. That simple. So I hope you guys got something out of this video review. I wanted to make sure that we kind of cleared up a lot of this, because you will hear a lot of people saying that this is an alternative to a Raspberry Pi 5, or your mini PCs. I can't fully agree with that, because even these two, even though both of these are X86 processors, this mini PC is roughly the same, almost the same price as this X1. But this one has a slightly better chip in here with the N95. This one has the one that's one step underneath it. Obviously, we're going to get more power out of this mini PC because it is a better chip, but they're two different form factors. So I can't fully say or be honest, with anybody that says, hey, well, they're comparable. No, they're not comparable. This is a single board computer. This is a mini PC. Do you have access to any of this stuff, all these GPIO pins or anything? No, you don't. You don't. Now, you can use an M.2 slot and everything else on the bottom of it, obviously, but and then, of course, plug in some additional attachments that you can't even see, because there are additional pin sets here on the board, which allows you to plug in more. But no, that's more comparable to a Raspberry Pi 5, not a mini PC. But again, as far as price, yes, you can, but no. But again, hope you guys enjoyed this video. These are the cream of the crops that if you are a home arcade modder, retro gaming enthusiast, and you're looking to emulate anything up from your basic stuff again to your PS2s. And oh, forgot to mention, in some cases, this can run low-end PS3 games as well as this. This can run like your Turtles in Time or something like that on PS3. I know Pymaniac, who also has both of these boards. We talk a lot about these particular boards here. He already has them. He's a reseller in Australia. He's ran some low-end PS3 on this particular chipset. This can't do PS3, and neither can the Orange Pi 5. So hope you guys keep those things in mind. I hope this answered a lot of your questions. X86 versus ARM. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, got something out of it. Like and subscribe. Let me know if you have Any additional questions, we'll have some unboxing videos, but because I have all these here, wanted to dispel a lot of rumors and clear up a lot of information for those of you looking to do your homework or buy for your home arcade stuff. But and then there's another one coming out. But these are the ones that you guys need to have if you're looking for a low-cost solution that will get you the best bang for your butt. But you guys have a great night. This is kiodiekin signing out. I will catch you guys.
This is it for me.